Hello and welcome to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. The story of political extremism in the United States is one of the defining trends of the current era. This is a disturbing development that has touched every facet of American life, and even institutions once thought to be as unequivocally American as apple pie, Disney, the Super Bowl halftime show and the FBI, have all been sucked into the maelstrom of this malaise. The legal activist and organiser Leonard Leo, the subject of today's episode, has been instrumental in politicising one of the most important institutions of them all, the United States Supreme Court. In fact, given Leo's pivotal role in placing 6 conservative judges on America's highest court, you could say he has done more to polarise the court than any other person. The Supreme Court, whose role it is to ensure that legislation passed by Congress is constitutional, is increasingly becoming the final word in American political life. Therefore, the liberal-conservative balance of the 9 judges sitting on it is, other than which party controls the White House, the most visceral and important litmus test for which side is winning the so-called culture war, or as comedian Bill Maher recently put it, America's cold civil war. Today's episode, then, whilst nominally about Leo, is the story of how America came to obsess about the political positions of 9 unelected people who should be out of the public eye. Europeans have come to view the US Supreme Court with bemusement. But given the court's recent decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, a 1970s court decision which ostensibly guaranteed abortion rights nationwide, understanding the centrality of the court's influence has never been more important. My guest for this conversation is Ken Vogel, who writes for the New York Times and primarily investigates the influence of big money in his country's politics. He is the author of a recent exposé of Leonard Leo, which you can read online. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Leonard Leo. Hi Ken, how are you?
Hey, it's great to be with you.
Ken, we're talking about Leonard Leo today. He has become a very important character in the shadows of American politics, American conservative politics. He was born in 1965. He's probably the most obscure person I've discussed on this podcast to date. He's not an elected official. Why should people know who he is? Why is he important?
Well, perhaps more than any single person, he has played an influential role in pulling the Supreme Court of the United States to the right. He was involved in the cultivation and certainly the nomination and confirmation of every single of the 6 conservative justices on the U.S. Supreme Court who now make up a conservative majority with a real iron grip, outnumbering the liberals by 6-3, and entertaining a number of subject matters and cases, and actually issuing a number of decisions that have advanced conservative causes more than any individual politician or elected official, I think, over the last several decades.
He went to Cornell University as a law student. Is Cornell known for being particularly conservative? I wouldn't say particular British universities produce kind of left-wing or right-wing politicians. It's kind of a mix. Is it different in the US with the Ivy League system? Are there kind of liberal and conservative universities?
There are some that are known to be more conservative, but for the most part, universities, particularly elite ones, have reputations for being more left-leaning. That was one of the things that was sort of an animating moment or cause in Leonard Leo's life when he got to Cornell and saw what he regarded and what a number of fellow conservative law students, not just at Cornell, but at other elite universities around the country, regarded as a real leftward tilt of the academy, and particularly the legal academy. And so what they did was they banded together to form the Federalist Society, and Leo was not among the founding fathers of it, but in rather short order after it was founded at Yale, he founded a branch at Cornell University in 1989.
Yeah, so he's now the co-chairman of the Federalist Society still, I think. I suppose it might be worth pondering for a second on what a Federalist is.
Yeah, the Federalist is someone who adheres to the tenets laid out in the Federalist Papers, and those are basically, not to oversimplify, but they are basically about the primacy of state rule. That is, that state governments are close to the people and should have the authority to make policies and laws that really are preeminent in shaping American life, and that the federal government in many ways should be secondary, and the primary role of the federal government is more about national defense and interstate commerce and things that are not left better left in the hands of the states, according to Federalists. And so this is a worldview that comports very much with conservatism and has for many years. I should say, though, that more recently Donald Trump has defied that in some ways, but traditionally the Republican Party has embraced the tenets of federalism, and that has led to their advocacy for small federal government, for low taxation, for sort of elevating the market, the free enterprise system, as sort of more of a shaping factor of American life, and those are very much Leonard Leo's beliefs.
The kind of opposite of all of those things are tenets that are broadly supported by the Democratic Party. The idea of having a larger federal government, higher levels of federal taxation. I think in terms of I said that Leo was born in the 60s. The kind of 60s and 70s in many people's eyes are seen as a time when the Supreme Court was quite liberal. It sided mostly with democratic ways of thinking. Is that true?
Certainly that was the perception, yes. Some legal scholars pushed back on that, but I think that was broadly the perception. It was certainly Leonard Leo's perception. And let's not forget, this came at a time, the 60s, a time in American life when many of the sort of fundamental institutions of American society were being challenged from the left. We're thinking about, the government. We're thinking about the military intervention in Vietnam, producing huge waves of protest from the left, and we're thinking about the rise of the civil rights movement, challenging, pushing for voting rights and pushing for civil rights reforms that the federal government had not been particularly eager to engage in because they were seen as lightning rods. And the national parties were very sensitive to losing votes in the South. And so, there was really, the energy was on the left at this time, and the energy remained on the left through, the early 80s and the Reagan Revolution. And this was at a time when Leonard Leo was sort of in his formative years, seeing the Reagan Revolution. And I think he really embraced that and latched onto it. And what's interesting is that in some ways the efforts that he embraced initially with the Federalist Society and pushing the courts and the legal profession to the right are not dissimilar from what we saw from the right back in the 60s and late 60s and early 70s. The right was seeing some of these factors, some of these dynamics that I described, and they were debating quietly amongst themselves, including, interestingly, a guy by the name of Lewis Powell, who was a prominent lawyer who was working with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and wrote this famous memo about how big business needed to rally together and invest in institutions that would be able to push back on what he saw as a leftward tilt in Hollywood and in politics and in the academy. And so that was really a rallying cry for the right. And fast forward to last year, Leonard Leo is embracting that approach and adopting it in sort of a 2.0 kind of way to fight back against what he sees as another wave of leftward pressure and leftward grip on these key institutions in our society.
The US president gets to nominate somebody to be on the Supreme Court if there is a vacancy. But he has to have that, or she has to have that nomination confirmed by the Senate. I want to start by talking about 1992 and the nomination of Clarence Thomas, because I think it's quite a significant moment here. Thomas is the longest-serving justice on the Supreme Court. He was nominated by George Bush Sr. in 1992, and I think Leo aided him in his nomination. How would you characterize Thomas, and how significant has he been in terms of what he's done to the court?
Well, yes, it is true that Leonard Leo aided in that confirmation. That was the first one that he was involved in. It's actually interesting. He's a personal history there, in that he did his clerkship on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, where Clarence Thomas was a judge, and they became friendly. And so when Clarence Thomas was tapped, when he was nominated to be on the Supreme Court, Leonard Leo volunteered to help his confirmation. And he was seen as a cause célèbre on the right. Here was an African-American jurist who was really an ardent adherent to the orthodoxy of sort of conservative legal thought, the very types of sort of philosophies that the Federalist Society and that Leonard Leo had embraced and fostered and tried to perpetuate in the legal profession. And he was a black guy, and he was going to, get on the Supreme Court. And so he was really celebrated. The right rallied around him. And then the nomination, this is sort of the early stages, I should back up and say that it used to be that these nominations of Supreme Court justices were not particularly political. That changed with the Republican nomination of Robert Bork, and that was defeated actually by Biden. Biden was sort of, as a senator, led the charge to derail the nomination of Robert Bork. And so it was becoming, these nomination fights were, confirmation fights, I should say, were becoming real politically fraught and sort of, forums for political debate. And that, against that backdrop, Clarence Thomas's nomination, which seemed to have support until there were these sexual harassment allegations made against him, and that sort of got the parties to their respective corners and got both sides dug in even more. Leonard Leo has said that was one of the moments where he realized that these fights were becoming important to not just the court and jurisprudence in the U.S., but to politics. And that was his sort of first front row seat to that.
Yeah, so that happened in 1992. I thought I'd read a bit of a speech from 1992 that in many ways tells you a lot about the country America has become since. So it's a speech from Pat Buchanan at the Republican National Convention in 1992. He spoke and he said, "My friends, this election is about more than who gets what. It is about who we are. It is about what we believe and what we stand for as Americans. There is a religious war going on in this country. It's a cultural war, as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as was the Cold War itself. For this war is for the soul of America. And in that struggle for the soul of America, Clinton and Clinton are on the other side, and George Bush is on our side. And so, to the Buchanan brigades out there, we have to come home and stand behind George Bush." I think that kind of culture bashing sounds very normal in US politics today, but it was considered quite shocking in the early 90s. The reason I wanted to read it out is because the court has become a massive battleground in that cultural war that Buchanan spoke about. In broad terms, what would you say has happened to the court since Thomas joined it in 1992? Not necessarily because of Thomas, but because of other nominations since.
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily a straight trajectory where it became, it started becoming political with the Bork failed nomination, and then Thomas's successful but quite controversial nomination. But it certainly has been the overall trend line, and this is where both sides, both sort of partisans on both sides of the political spectrum, see like their most important issues being like fought out. Sure, Congress makes decisions about spending and wars and even healthcare, but really the ultimate decisions are being made by the court. And healthcare is a good example. That the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, which was the U.S.'s best sort of most aggressive effort to reform the healthcare system was challenged in the court, and John Roberts sort of tried to find a compromise solution. John Roberts, a Republican nominee, the Chief Justice, tried to find a compromise solution, and conservatives were quite upset about that. They thought that Roberts betrayed them because they had come to view the court as this political battleground. And why was a Republican nominee who became the Chief Justice helping Democrats keep like a political victory in place? They wanted him to be more like a politician. And so, some of the justices, including Thomas, have been sort of more loyal, more predictable in taking a position that is generally held by the Republican Party. And in the case of Thomas, and on the left, there are justices who have been more reliable votes sort of with the Democratic side. But both parties sort of see this as like where the ultimate decisions will be made about the issues about which they care most deeply. Obviously, this is most acute, most recently, in the decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, granting a constitutional right to abortion, and that was seen as a huge victory for Leonard Leo and Leonard Leo's theory of the case that the court was in some ways political. He wouldn't say that, he wouldn't put it quite that way, but that like this was where this was an important part of like the American governing system that should be treated as, the efforts to shape it should be treated as political fights as opposed to just strictly legal fights.
Yeah, and I think one way you can tell how much both sides care about this, I said earlier that the Senate has to confirm the nomination of a president to the Supreme Court. And those nominations have become much, much nastier and much closer in terms of, so if you have 100 senators, it used to be in the 60s and 70s, I think that most justices would end up on there with the confirmation of, what, like 80, 90 senators?
Yeah, I mean, there was a long tradition of bipartisan confirmation votes, and that is gone, and it elevates the sort of intensity of these fights because the Senate itself is so closely divided, and will likely remain so closely divided, even if it flips in the election on Tuesday. It will be it will be a narrow balance of power for Republicans, and so if there are confirmation fights, and by the way, I should say it's not just the Supreme Court confirmation fights. There are confirmation fights over judges of lower courts and over cabinet nominees. It just so happens that the Supreme Court is like the Super Bowl of these fights for the reasons that we just discussed. And it attracts a ton of money on both sides, where advocates for for confirming a Republican appointee or defeating a Republican appointee or vice versa are spending like tens of millions of dollars trying to not just influence the senators who are casting the vote on the confirmation, but the public, to make these fights into an issue that voters, when they go into the ballot box, are thinking about. Not just like what this Senate candidate will do on any range of issues related to their state, but what they'll do to advance their interest in the Supreme Court and to vote for or against Supreme Court nominees who adhere to a sort of set of views and philosophies that the voters hold dear and consider to be. Considered to be linked to a political party as opposed to judicial philosophies in and of themselves.
You talked about the ruling from this summer about abortion, which basically the Supreme Court ruled that states have the right to pass their own legislation determining their own abortion law, overturning previous precedent from the Supreme Court from 1973. There have obviously been other kind of canary in the coal mine moments. I think the Heller ruling in 2008 struck down gun control legislation, and the Voting Rights Act has been stripped back by the court. And all of these things are down to people that Leo has put on the court. Other than Clarence Thomas, he's put on he's helped John Roberts and Samuel Alito, and I think some of Trump's nominees as well. When you say helping them with their nomination, what does that actually mean in practical terms?
So a good example, I mean, I mentioned the example of Clarence Thomas, and that was early in Leo's career and Leo's sort of affiliation with the conservative legal movement. But maybe a better example would be the inverse. So helping with the nomination is, something where you would, help prepare a candidate. First, I mean, Leo goes beyond that. Leo is actually helping to sort of hone the list, the sort of menu of potential nominees from which Republican Republican presidents have chosen their Supreme Court nominees. And, he famously, this phenomenon famously became even more pronounced and open in a way, sort of transparent and transparently transactional when Donald Trump was running for president. And after a meeting with Leo and Don McGahn, who was a sort of Federalist Society, a lawyer who's involved in the Federalist Society who was serving as the Trump campaign's general counsel, McGahn and Leo basically urged Trump to release a list during his campaign, unheard of, released a list of folks from whom he would choose to fill Supreme Court vacancies. And so Leo shaped that list, and then, Trump selected a nominee from that list. He selected 3 nominees from variations of that list, but the first one was Neil Gorsuch, and Leo helped craft, or groups associated with Leo helped craft campaigns to sort of pitch Gorsuch, not just to the senators, including Democratic senators, but to firm up Republican support for them, but to the public, airing ads, running out in various states, usually swing states, where there was a senator who might was considered to be a potential swing vote, urging voters to call the senators to vote for Neil Gorsuch. So that would be an example of shaping. But I should back up, because perhaps the most unprecedented thing, which Leo also had his fingerprints on, happened before Trump was elected, and that was that Leo helped derail a nomination of Barack Obama's last nomination to fill the vacancy, the seat on the Supreme Court made vacant by the death of Antonin Scalia, who was a real hero. He talked about, whether Clarence Thomas has been a leader in conservative judicial philosophy, and I'd say Clarence Thomas has been more of a follower in conservative judicial philosophy, but a loyal one at that. A leader in conservative judicial philosophy who was really a champion of the Federalist Society and vice versa was Antonin Scalia. So when he died during the final months of Barack Obama's presidency, Democrats were in a real rush to get through a nominee so that there would not be the possibility that if Trump won, he would not appoint a nominee who, would be considered palatable to the left and to Democrats. And so Obama appointed a nominee. He was Merrick Garland, who's the current Attorney General. So that should tell you that this nomination was not successful. And it was in part because Leonard Leo worked with Mitch McConnell, who was then the Senate Majority Leader, the Senate Republican leader. So the Republicans had the Senate. So Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland would need to get approval from some Republican senators in order to have the votes sufficient to be confirmed. And Leonard Leo helped to hold that line and support a really, if not unprecedented, certainly uncommon position by Mitch McConnell that this seat, this nomination and the seat would have to remain vacant for several months until the next election, because it was more appropriately the next president starting anew with a full 4-year term ahead of him or her who should make this nomination. So that really showed the power of the conservative legal movement and Mitch McConnell's buy-in to it and his alliance with Leonard Leo in a way that I think just the more traditional supporting of a nomination does not really illustrate.
Well, that decision was dubious enough, but it was made completely hypocritical when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died a few weeks before the last presidential election. Donald Trump filled the post anyway, without waiting for the election.
with support from none other than Mitch McConnell and Leonard Leo. So yes, I think that sort of laid bare the politics behind it. And, Mitch McConnell is fairly open about the politics behind it. And he's fairly open that this is one of his main issues. And Leonard Leo has really become his wingman and his enforcer in executing his strategy and in getting buy-in from the right. And I don't just mean the right like politicians on the right, though certainly that is true, but I mean the conservative-based voters. Like Leonard Leo, in addition to having his fingerprints on each of these nominations, I think is probably as much to credit or blame, depending on your perspective, for making the Supreme Court nomination fights into a political issue and a voting issue every election cycle, but particularly presidential election cycles.
That points to a very anti-democratic element in your politics. I mean, this is a very bizarre state to be in, where one of the most important parts of being elected president of the United States is that you spend 4 years trying to pack courts.
Yeah, I mean, it's become sort of open. Like it was, even if it was the case, decades earlier, and I think there was always sort of an element to that. That was one of the lasting legacies of presidents, because the Supreme Court seat is for life, or until the person steps down, and they usually don't step down until they're sort of forced to it. Sometimes they don't, and the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg is a good example, or probably in retrospect, even though she was being cheered on and sort of yes queen by the left, would have been better for the left of the Democratic Party had she stepped down during the Obama administration and given Obama a chance to fill the seat as opposed to risking a Republican president come in. But anyway, I think that like your point is correct, that like it's become more open. Like right now, presidential candidates and their aides and their campaigns and their supporters are sort of like openly cheering on the prospect of that person getting to fill a number of seats on the court. And it's like a raison d'etre for like some of these campaigns and presidential candidates is to fill Supreme Court seats.
I mean, it's also very negative because these judges aren't like passing things exactly. They're just reacting to legislation that's already in. They're kind of banning things, and it's, banning abortion or overturning a law, or, I mean, there's no kind of positive legislation making here. I mean, you mentioned earlier, obviously, that it's kind of a release valve for cultural issues that people really care about. How much of the fact that the court has become so important recently is down to the fact that Congress is so dysfunctional? Is it that?
Yeah, 100%. It's Congress doesn't pass things, and it's when it does, it's at the margins. Whereas the Supreme Court is able to strike down a pillar of U.S. law and life and constitutional interpretations. Really, like shape the interpretation of the Constitution in a way that has more impact than anything that Congress could do or that a president could do, short of going to war, of course. And like you do see that, and you have seen that during the Trump administration. We talked about the decisions on abortion. I think you mentioned the decisions on guns, separation of church and state, the Clean Air Act. I mean, that's another one. There's a lot of the, I talked about Leonard Leo and the Federalist sort of mentality being one of emphasizing the states and emphasizing sort of allowing the free market to fill in some of these spaces in public life, and striking down environmental regulations that hinder manufacturing or that are costly for big business to comply with. That has been a top goal of the sort of country club conservative, or the business side wing of the Republican Party. For as long as the Environmental Protection Agency has been in existence, and they achieved quite a number of victories, large victories in on that front in the last few years. During as a result of the Trump nominees to the Supreme Court, and Leonard Leo, and the work that Leonard Leo did to get them there. But
it's worth pointing out that the Republicans, in spite of having 6 conservative justices on the Supreme Court. They've only won the popular vote at one election since 1992, one presidential election. And I know that obviously that, because of the Electoral College, that's not how the presidency is decided, but it's still worth pointing out. It does sort of point to a kind of conservative takeover by stealth.
Yeah, I mean, they Leonard Leo wouldn't put it that way. He would say, like, this is the system, and
well, no, he
playing
wouldn't,
within the rules of the system. But yeah, there's something, there's a tension there, and critics will say that the Supreme Court has become anti-democratic, and, maybe it always was, and it just had not been as openly used as sort of a pawn or a cudgel in partisan politics, and now it is, or at least it is more openly. I think the thing that's interesting about Leo and his approach is, whether he openly acknowledges that or not, I don't think he would. He's applied a similar approach to other areas of American politics, and his success in shaping the Supreme Court has really endeared him to major donors on the right and politicians on the right who are eager to give him the money and the leash to try to apply those same principles to like other areas of life. And so what I mean by that is he's seeding a number of these groups, dark money groups that raise unlimited sums from donors without having to disclose the donors' identities, to sort of wage political warfare both in the courts and in the sort of public sphere on a number of other issues. And the confluence of that and his work on the courts, I think, is quite interesting. And you could foresee a scenario in which he is helping groups. Here's just an example. His network is seeding this group that brought the cases that led to the Supreme Court case on affirmative action that the Supreme Court just heard. Well, it seems possible, if not likely, that the Supreme Court will, in this decision on this case, take a big cut out of affirmative action, and that would be a huge victory for the sort of culture warriors on the right who have long opposed affirmative action. So you have sort of the specter, and I'm not saying this is actually the sort of full cycle of this has played itself out, but you have the specter of Leonard Leo supporting, shaping the court through this sort of dark money advocacy and his alliances with Republican politicians, and then sort of shaping the jurisprudence by funding groups that bring cases to that very court to accomplish goals of the conservative movement. And you could see why that would be viewed by critics as sort of undemocratic.
Yeah, and it's now become a sort of legislation making body kind of in and of itself. I mean, the most troubling one that I've read recently is one that's going to come up next month. I think it's called Moore versus Harper.
Right, and Leonard Leo is involved in that as well. So that is a case over basically state legislative authority over elections. And so the concern would be that like state legislatures in Republican states could sort of use the rig the election process to benefit Republicans, or vice versa. But this is coming from the right. The case stems from a challenge from the right, and again, there you have that case has been aided by amicus briefs, friends of the court briefs, from groups that Leonard Leo has helped start and fund. So it's another example of that sort of hypothetical that I mentioned, and maybe a better example than the affirmative action case, because the Moore case is actually more recent and has Leonard Leo's fingerprints sort of more firmly on it, or at least his network's fingerprints more firmly on it. And that would be another victory. And, look, they would say there too, they would find sort of philosophical justification and say, well, this is federalism. This is what we're talking about. The state should control the election. Well, there's actually a constitutional role for the federal government in creating election rules as well. This is sort of what the Supreme Court will have to decide.
I mean, from what I've read, the implication of this ruling, if it got passed, could be that state legislatures would be free to pass legislation that allowed them, that gave those very state legislators the right to award electoral college votes to whichever candidate they wanted, irrespective of the popular vote in their state.
That, I think, is sort of the furthest extreme. I think that like the Leonard Leo's folks would say that is not what they have in mind, but certainly that would be the nightmare scenario for defenders of free and open elections.
But many of the Supreme Court justices that Leo has helped nominate also said that they wouldn't overturn Roe versus Wade, right?
I don't know about many. Certainly, Alito has. There was a passage released from Ted Kennedy's diary, I believe, where Alito had some kind of assurance for him to that effect, and Kavanaugh told Susan Collins, the senator from Maine, who was a Republican but sort of a liberal or centrist Republican, that he would not do that. And so, yeah, I mean, part of these confirmation fights, and this is why it's so sort of jarring to see them become so political and openly political, is that, like, it had been the case, and it's even still the case, that these nominees for these Supreme Court seats, they don't want to tip their hand. They want to, like, be able to come into the Supreme Court with a blank slate, not a blank slate, but like with at least the patina of having an open mind on cases that they could hear, on issues that they are expected to hear cases about, like abortion. And so it's long been this game where, partisans or people or advocates of on one or the other side of an issue would scour past opinions of these judges if they sat on lower courts, and they have all sat on lower courts, Supreme Court nominees, but to try to find hints, like, how would they rule on this? What have they said on this issue? And then the senators would ask them about these decisions and try to read the tea leaves and push them to say things that were more declarative about their position on these issues. And the nominees would almost always defer. Certainly their goal to defer and to not come down and not really give a declarative statement on these things. And so, when liberals and when Democrats have tried to push some of these conservative nominees for their position on Roe v. Wade and abortion rights more generally, they would say things like, I generally believe in precedent, or John Roberts, really focused on stare decisis, the principle that a decision that was decided is decided, and this court is not going to go back on itself. And here, obviously, with Roe v. Wade, you had an example of the court doing just that. And that is, I think, fueled the perception, certainly on the left, but, maybe the polls suggest more broadly that the Supreme Court has, lost some faith as an unbiased institution among the American public.
Is there any way, do you think, that the Supreme Court could be made, let's say, more functional and less political? I mean, it's worth noting that most constitutional scholars would agree that the Supreme Court hasn't always been this powerful in the past. There's lots of people who say that within the Constitution it actually was never supposed to play this kind of activist role. But obviously, within the very divided Congress that you have, it's very unlikely that you're going to get sort of constitutional amendments through. Are there things outside the realms of constitutional amendments that could be done to the court to make it, to kind of reform it into a more palatable organization for both sides?
I'm not a legal scholar. I know that there are all manner of proposals that are out there. I tend to agree with your assessment that they're not going anywhere. It's very difficult to as you noted, to pass any legislation, let alone amending the Constitution or amending, doing anything else to, like, fundamentally change a core institution of American life. What I will say is that partisans on both sides, and certainly Leonard Leo is at the front of the line when we talk about this, have engaged in sort of pressure campaigns on the court over cases. And, you see this manifesting itself. This is something that Leo has not done, but you see this manifesting itself in protests in front of Supreme Court justices' houses, or, confrontations in restaurants, maybe that hasn't happened with the Supreme Court, it certainly happens with senators, but where, the activists are confronting or trying to confront justices over their decisions, trying to pressure them one way or the other. And it's hard, I don't want to try to get in the head of a Supreme Court justice, but it's hard to see how that would have much of an impact, and if anything might sort of cement a view of, if the justice was inclined to have an opposite view that the protesters were pushing to, would seem more likely to cement that view. But, obviously these people are supposed to be basing their decisions on the law and their interpretation of how cases implicate the law, and so you would hope that they could set that aside. But that just goes to show sort of how fraught these battles of the Supreme Court, not just the nominations, but the Supreme Court cases themselves have become.
It's worth noting, for example, that it doesn't say anywhere in the Constitution that there has to be 9 justices, as there are. Do you think that there's a reasonable chance that a president in future attempts to sort of pack the court and put justices on there? This does have some precedent. President Roosevelt in the 1930s attempted to put Supreme Court justices onto the court.
Certainly it's something that's talked about. I mean, Biden formed a commission to look at the court, and that was one of the things that it talked about. I don't know how it came down on that, but Pete Buttigieg, for instance, the transportation secretary under Biden, who ran against Biden for the Democratic nomination in 2020, has talked about the possibility of sort of packing the court. That's seen as a pretty radical stance, but so too, I think would overturning Roe v. Wade was seen as sort of like a radical outcome by a number of people, certainly on the left. So it's hard for me to see that happening, but it's certainly something that's talked about, and I think will probably continue to get attention, maybe more attention, as the Supreme Court becomes viewed as more political and becomes more of a political hot potato and issue in the 2024 election, presidential election.
I used the term takeover by stealth earlier to describe what's happened on the Supreme Court. Obviously, the success from the point of view of conservatives like Leonard Leo of doing this, its kind of success in the short term is pretty clear. They get exactly what they want in terms of abortion rights and gun control, federal election running, things like that, which has obviously become a huge issue in the midterms now. But there's not a lot of evidence that these issues are popular with the public. Do you think in the end the conservative movement in America is kind of eating itself in a way, but because it's constantly triangulating to positions that are actually, if you look at polls, less and less popular? Abortion, kind of banning abortion, has never been more unpopular in the States than it is right now, for instance.
I mean, it's an interesting argument. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I would just say, as far as the potential for a backlash, yeah, for sure, there's a potential for a backlash. That said, I think one of the more fundamental transformations that this court and that the previous iterations of conservative majority Supreme Court have undertaken is reshaping the rules and sort of the laws that govern elections and political battle more generally to a landscape that favors Republicans, and that has favored, at least the thought was that it would favor Republicans. So sure, we're talking about Moore v. Harper. That's a recent. That's a pending case. But let's go back to Citizens United, and that was in a divided court, but it was one where the conservative position on this prevailed. That was a case that struck down limits or restrictions on corporations and labor unions and other groups spending on political advertising. It famously held that that corporations had the right of free speech. That was the grounds on which it was decided, and that the political landscape, the campaign finance landscape that emerged in the wake of that decision was the one that allowed Leonard Leo and his groups to raise all this money to spend on political advertising that tried to use the Supreme Court as an issue and allowed Mitch McConnell, and by the way, I should say Mitch McConnell was a huge advocate of that decision, and he and Leo, that's another area in which they are like very simpatico, shaping the courts and fighting against campaign finance restrictions on how much money you can spend and how you can spend money in elections and whether donors should be disclosed. And they have been on the march on that front. There's been, the court has issued a number of decisions, including a recent one involving Ted Cruz, that have weakened the campaign finance infrastructure in a way that, generally speaking, has been seen as advantageous to conservatives and Republicans in their efforts to shape the political discourse and to shape election fights. Democrats have fought back, and they more recently have, raised and spent huge sums of this dark money, as I call it, as people call it themselves. But, it doesn't minimize the degree to which this conservative judicial movement that Leonard Leo has shaped the political battlefield in a way that's more fundamental and structural than any given specific issue, and has been embraced by Republicans and conservatives to try to win elections, even as there may be backlash or advantages that ebb and flow on any given issue.
Do you think when Leo was sitting in his room in Cornell in, let's say, 1985, 1990, whenever he was at university, do you think that this was all not just in his head, but in the kind of Federalist Society? Do you think this was a grand plan, or do you think they've just kind of taken their opportunities and they've come, or is this where they wanted to go?
I think a lot of the again, credit or blame for shaping the Federalist Society, making the powerhouse that it is, and the powerhouse that it is, and shaping the Supreme Court, does ultimately fall at Leo's feet. The Federalist Society initially was really more of like a networking group for people to get together and sort of wring their hands and grumble about the leftward dominance of the legal academy and the courts. And Leo was the one who made it into this pipeline for developing conservative legal talent and working with conservative lawmakers and politicians to get them to buy into the principles and get them to support the nominations of jurists who were coming through this pipeline for federal and state judgeships. And again, this is a model that he is attempting to apply more broadly across society, developing this conservative talent pipeline on other issues, education fights the right has made, critical race theory a real rallying cry, this idea that there's sort of revisionist history being taught in our public and private schools, and race, consideration of race and admissions. Even a big one that he's seizing on now is corporate ESG, trying to cow corporations that are using environmental and social criteria in their investment and business decisions, to try to say that is an abrogation of their fiduciary responsibility, publicly traded corporations, to their stockholders. So he's really bringing some of these same principles to trying to undermine what he sees as liberal dominance in other areas of American life and American politics and American media and entertainment and culture. And it's a pretty ambitious plan, but so too was the overhauling of the U.S. Supreme Court, and he seems to have succeeded there.
Yeah, and the whole thing, in a way, has relied on quite a lot of luck as well. I mean, if you think that if Hillary Clinton had won in 2016, she might well have ended up getting 3 Supreme Court picks, like Trump did.
Yeah, that's right. And I think he probably would have, he sort of stepped back from the Federalist Society a little bit. He's still, as you mentioned, the co-chair, but he's no longer running it on a day-to-day basis like he was until recently. And the reason why I think he stepped back from that and sort of shifted his focus to this more ambitious, broader application of the same principles and tactics to other fights is that he feels like he succeeded. He feels like he sort of won that fight over the Supreme Court. Now he's on to other fights. And you're right. If Hillary Clinton had won, I'm sure there's a counterfactual in which he would have stuck with the Federal Society and working to overhaul the Supreme Court. And maybe it would have taken another decade or 2 decades, because if Hillary Clinton had 3 picks and it was 6-3 the other way, 6-3 liberal dominance of the Supreme Court, that's a pretty deep hole to dig out from. Would have been for Leonard Leo and the Republicans and the conservatives, and now it's a huge hole for the liberals to dig out from. And I should say that there are now liberal groups, or there's one in particular that was kind of patterned after what Leonard Leo did with the Federal Society. It's called Demand Justice, that's working to sort of elevate court fights for the left, because the left realized we kind of got outmaneuvered here by Leonard Leo, and we need to play some catch up, and again, it's a pretty far distance for them to catch up at this point.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's going to take them their whole adult lives, assuming that they're also, the age that Leonard Leo started out at.
That's right, and there's no guarantee. I mean, Trump or Ron DeSantis could win in 2024, and they could get they could get a vacancy or 2. Who knows?
The midterms are tomorrow, Ken. We're recording on Monday, the 7th of November. What has Leo been doing over the last sort of 3 or 4 weeks as this campaign has gotten to its final stages?
Well, the groups that he's funded have continued to wage these fights over some of these issues: abortion rights, guns, affirmative action, both through litigation, and it's including litigation that's made all the way to the Supreme Court, and also through advertising campaigns. They spend a ton of money going after some of these corporations. BlackRock is one. It's a massive investment firm that has been a leader in corporate ESG, and they've tried, they spent tens of millions of dollars. I should say tens. They've spent at least $10 million, probably more than $10 million, going after BlackRock, trying to get them to back away from stances that they see in advertising campaigns that they see as sort of helping Democrats. And they have, done similar things on a number of issues, and particularly on abortion, where thanks to the Supreme Court's decision, this fight is now back in the states, and there are a number of there have been already some ballot measures and state legislative campaigns, congressional campaigns, Senate campaigns that have been fought out over abortion, and Leonard Leo's groups are spending a lot of money to try to make sure that their candidates who hold similar positions as them are triumphant on Tuesday.
The run-up to the midterms has been very fraught. Obviously, the incident involving Nancy Pelosi's husband last week was pretty awful. What's it like in the States today?
Fraught, yeah, that's a good way to describe it. I mean, there's a sort of expression. We political reporters joke about how every election cycle you have partisans on both sides saying this is the most important election of our lifetime. And it's, it seems sometimes a little cynical, but increasingly it feels like people do believe that. The other one is that people say, every election is the most expensive election of our lifetime. And inflation, cost of living, people spend more for the same stuff, whether it's advertising or mail or salaries of campaign staff. But the degree to which there has been more spending this midterm cycle over the last midterm cycle is quite pronounced, and I think it does sort of buttress this idea that many people really do feel that this is the most important election of their lifetime.
I mean, the midterms, obviously, and what's happened with the courts are sort of two sides of the same coin, because they're two different branches of your government. Do you think that you'll ever get back to just kind of how things were before, let's say, the 1990s, where these things were not? I mean, the elections in the States have obviously always been very fraught, and it's got a very aggressive political culture, always has done. But do you think that you'll ever get back to a stage where these elections are anything less than total war?
It's tough to see that. I mean, there is incentive for these politicians to rile up their base. That's this sort of polarized environment that we're in. Like, that gets more likes and retweets and donations and votes ultimately, at least in primaries, than taking a more moderate centrist stance. I mean, we used to think, my sort of roots are in covering money in politics and influence in politics, so you can see why I would come to the Leonard Leo story. But we used to say that, it would take to pass serious campaign finance reform or serious political reforms would be a major scandal that would sort of shake awake, voters and make them vote on these sort of democracy issues as a top priority, as opposed to, the cost of gas or their health care or decisions of war and peace. And I don't know what more it will take. I mean, we've seen so many major scandals, not necessarily campaign finance scandals, but January 6th and, Trump's efforts to overturn the result of the election and Trump's 2 impeachments and the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband. People just sort of, they just retreat to their own corners. If it doesn't resonate with them or serve their political interest to highlight this scandal or controversy, that they're just going to gloss over it and ignore it and try to convince others to do the same. So it's in some ways it's a little discouraging, but this is the political system, and I'm covering it as opposed to advocating for a specific outcome.
Well, on that cheery note, Ken, thank you very much. I enjoyed that. If people want to read your stuff and go on that journey with you as you try to cover this very interesting political system, to say the least, where can they go?
I report for the New York Times. They can go over to nytimes.com or follow me on Twitter at Ken Vogel.
Thank you, Ken.
Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, so you never miss new content.